So we wanted to kick off with a context for the future. How will life change? By 2050, the world will have 9 billion people in it, and around 70% of them will live in urban environments, which is a significant increase from today. How can we reimagine our roles as businesses to promote a better quality of life through products and services, the brands that we offer? Here to catalyse that conversation between three very exciting experts, what it would take to have meaningful lives in the future, is Sharon Johnson. Sharon is a marketeer with a social justice heart who runs Repurpose, which is our social consultancy. She's originally South African and has lived and worked on 5 continents, developing strategies for startups and transformational brands, as well as not-for-profit organisations. Today, she advises FTSE 500 CEOs, music artists, civil society organisations and foundations on connecting business, brands, policy and citizens to create products and movements that spread. And most recently, she launched a climate change not-for-profit in her spare time called Track Zero, spearheading the goal for net zero emissions in the new International Climate Treaty. So welcome, Sharon, and your guests.
So I'm going to do some quick introductions to people who have a huge amount of influence in how the world is shifting in terms of the way we live and work and consume and enable poverty to be eradicated in the next 15 years. So firstly is Simon Mills, who is the Head of Sustainable Development for the City of London Corporation. Welcome, Simon. Simon has been a botanist in the forests of Costa Rica. He's run sustainable projects throughout the UK and in collaboration with many other cities and other European countries, and we're very lucky to have him here today. Oliver Heath is an architect, a writer, a TV presenter, a designer. So if he looks familiar, we did discuss earlier that a lot of people say, I've met you before. Well, maybe you have, but probably you just watch a bit of telly. So welcome, Oliver. Oliver is the pioneer of a design thinking and a design ethos, which he will talk to you about, so I won't try and preempt him, which is all about designing spaces for health and well-being, particularly urgent in the urbanizing world, and especially in a world like Europe, where all of our buildings are old and really need to change to meet the needs of the future. And then, of course, we have our wonderful Peter Lacey, who is the Global Managing Director of Sustainability and Strategy at Accenture, who's kind of fairly freshly off the plane from several years in Beijing, working throughout Asia. And Peter has advised UN Secretary Generals for many, many years. He's advised many, many CEOs, many of whom are now the most outspoken leaders in the sustainability arena. So welcome, Peter. And I might just plug, and you can tell us the name of it later, but might just plug that Peter's book on the circular economy is coming out really soon.
Thank you.
It'll be a fantastic read. So welcome and thank you very much. And I think each of you might make sort of just a few minutes of opening remarks, with or without slides. It's completely up to you, but we might ask Simon to talk about the context of the urban environment first.
Oh, okay. He who hesitates is lost. Let's see if this works. Looks like it's going to be without slides. Oh, there we go. Bit of a lag there. That'll do me. Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Mills, and I'm the Head of Sustainable Development for the City of London. What I'd like to do this afternoon is share some thoughts on abundance and boundaries and meaningful living. And to do this, I'm going to look at some of the physical and the metaphysical aspects of city life. So to begin with, I'd really like to say a few words about the organisation that I work for. I work for the City of London Corporation, which is the body that provides local government services for the square mile. Now, the city's got a tiny residential population, only about 8,500 people, but over 350,000 people commute in there to work every day in the 14,000 plus businesses that are located there, and together provide around 22% of London's GDP. So the square mile is a strategic national asset, But in today's globalised world, companies can choose to locate absolutely anywhere. Well, it's working. Excellent. So, if we're going to ensure that the city is the location of choice for multinational corporations, we actually need to look beyond tax regimes and consider what makes it the location of choice for the shiny headquarters buildings that we're after. And the answer is quite simply quality of life, because to attract the high flyers, the movers and the shakers and the superstar CEOs and their families, firms need to consider air quality, a functioning transport system, open spaces, decent schools, restaurants, theatres and art galleries, crime levels. The new wisdom is that it's the spaces between the buildings which are equally as important as the buildings themselves. And this is why in today's fluid information-based economy, national governments are becoming less important than city governments. It's not the UK versus the US, Germany or China anymore. It's London versus New York, London versus Berlin, London versus Sydney or Beijing or Paris. Now, if all of this seems somewhat academic, I should stress that we've all got a stake in this competition. As we've already heard, by 2050 there are going to be between 9 and 10 billion people on the planet. And the majority of these, around 75% according to UN estimates, are going to be living in cities. This additional population is going to have to be housed. They're going to have access to energy and water. They're going to need healthcare and education and public transport and telecommunications and retail and entertainment, and in short, everything that actually provides for civilized life in an urban society. However, even before the economic crisis of 2008, around a third of the world's city dwellers lived in favelas and shanty towns, slums that are going to grow in size by approximately 1 billion people over the next 20 years. Because, despite our rose-tinted view of the countryside, for farmers in developing economies, life is brutal, and chances to improve it are in very short supply. Whereas cities, well, cities are factories of the mind. They drive innovation, create wealth and provide opportunity. Better a waitress or an office cleaner with a dream to own a cafe or join the board than actually shoveling dung your whole life. Cities are wonderful. They contain wonders. But cities are also terrific because they can terrify. Mogadishu and Manchester have got roughly the same population, but the former is a stark reminder of what can actually happen to a city of 500,000 people, where basic infrastructure and services have broken down. People in cities matter, and the common wealth created by citizens is actually what makes cities valuable. So with this unprecedented growth in urban population, decision makers are faced with some fairly difficult challenges. The new infrastructure and services that cities desperately need is going to have to be provided in a resource-constrained, warming world at a time when public coffers are bare. But if the scale of the challenge is immense, so is the scale of the opportunity. The global opportunity in smart city technology is estimated at around $3.3 trillion by 2030. In water, it's 50 trillion. In infrastructure, it's 40 trillion. Make no mistake, the three titans of scarcity, supply and demand indicate that this market is going to be the biggest the world has ever seen. We're actually at the dawn of a new industrial revolution, and the UK is in pole position. We've got world-class academic institutions and visionary entrepreneurs who can design the cities and services of the future. We've got the architects and civil engineers to actually make these visions a reality. We've got the financial muscle in the City of London to pay for them. We've got the legal expertise to design the contracts, and we've got the insurance expertise to ensure that resilience is built in. Sustainable development is about continuous improvement to make things better for future generations. However, being efficient with resources is just the very tip of the iceberg. The thing about green businesses is their real strength is in the innovation of new products and services. And nowhere better illustrates this than the smart city revolution. Now, a working definition of a smart city is one which uses new technologies and innovation to become more livable, functional, and competitive. But of course, that definition hides a wealth of complexity. And I think currently there are two competing, but not necessarily mutually exclusive approaches to getting smart. I like to think of these as the Wizard of Oz and the hippie entrepreneur. The Wizard of Oz sees smart cities as super-connected, super-centralised systems in which the mayor hides behind the green curtain, pulling levers, seeing all and controlling all. However, the hippie entrepreneur rejects centralisation. She believes that data wants to be free, and smart cities give free access to all civic data so that 1,000 innovative flowers can bloom. Now, I don't know which of these models is going to prevail, and I could argue for a bit of both of them, as all great networking projects are collaborative. However, these opportunities depend on the commonwealth of data. Data is the irrigator of ideas. A place with a lot of data is the transaction hub of choice. Let me give you an example. Transport for London released all of the data for trains and bus timetables, real-time running information, fares and passenger numbers. A number of innovative London firms played with the data and turned it into apps for the smartphones that you've got in your pockets. Freeing data made London a global centre for software development of public transport apps. And the clever people who developed this software didn't stop there. They turned their talents to other areas, and the London tech boom took off. Looking to the future, how we gather and exchange data might actually define future cities. The new city walls will be data walls. Aqueducts will be replaced by broadband cables, and public squares by public Wi-Fi. There are, of course, all sorts of liberty and security issues, but open data could really transform the lives of all citizens. So in conclusions, cities are the key to sustainability. They're both the problem and the solution to abundance within boundaries and meaningful living, and they present immense opportunities for innovative and entrepreneurial businesses. Thank you.
Okay. Are we on? Yeah. Thank you very much. My name's Oliver Heath. I'm an architectural and interior designer, domestic energy assessor, writer, and television presenter. But all of my work focuses on making aspirational sustainability happen, creating a balance between the functional and the aesthetic. Now, traditionally, when we've discussed sustainability, we've taken a carbon-centric approach. We've looked at how we can reduce our use of resources and how we can make products and processes more efficient and reduce embodied carbon and carbon emissions. Equally, when we've discussed design, particularly interiors, it's often seen as a flippant sort of extravagance, something that's tacked on to the end of buildings, but with little reason for really being there. But what we're seeing now is a more human-centered approach to both design and sustainability, one that focuses on health and well-being, and in particular the emerging science of biophilic design. A new frontier in sustainability that offers tangible benefits to people, profits, and planet. Now, the World Green Business Council recently created a report that demonstrated that just 1% of typical business operating costs goes towards energy. So in that traditional discussion when we've talked about resource use and reducing it, we've only ever talked about reducing a fraction of 1% of those operating costs. Now, by contrast, 90% of typical business operating costs goes into staff costs. So if we were to take a more human-centered approach, just think about the benefits through increasing productivity, engagement, and connectivity with those staff and the task in hand. But how do we create spaces that actually improve creativity, improve productivity, that engage staff? Now, I want to frame this discussion with a couple of statistics. The World Health Organization states that the stress-related illnesses of cardiovascular disease and mental health disorders are likely to be the two main contributing factors to illness by 2020. Couple that with the fact that we're becoming increasingly urbanized. In fact, 90% of us Brits now live in urban areas. Means that we're seeing a reduced connection to nature and the many benefits it can bring. Combine this with increasing workloads, a pervasive creep of technology, and an always-on culture, which means that we have very little opportunity to recuperate, to kind of distance ourselves from that pressure, from that stress, and to aid mental and physical recuperation that we so badly need. Now, if I was to ask you just to think for a moment about the most tranquil, peaceful environment that you can imagine, what would it look like? Well, there's a very good chance it would include many of the items that you see here. Open areas of sky, grassland, trees, vegetation, plants, areas of grassland and water. But why is it that we share this utopian vision for an environment filled with nature? Now, the answer, I believe, lies in biophilia, humans' innate connection to nature and natural processes, something that's been built up over millennia through our habitation in rural and agrarian dwelling spaces. And that's something that our last 175 years of post-industrial living can't wipe out because it's genetically imprinted into us. We feel calmer, more rested, and more satisfied when we have environments like this. Now, biophilic design looks to take these ideas and use them as the principles to create more productive spaces by increasing that connection to nature. Now, this can sound complicated, but actually there are 4 very much simplified ideas behind biophilic design. Now, the first principle is this, that having views onto nature can calm us and restore our mental and physical energy. When we look at nature, and you are allowed to look at the view outside, I won't pick on you for that. It actually calms us down. It reduces our heart rate, it reduces our blood pressure level. So finding ways to incorporate nature inside and out. Finding ways to incorporate natural light is absolutely fundamental for the creation of better, more productive spaces. And the reason is because of this, our circadian rhythms. It's our body's reaction to periods of light and dark, roughly over a 24-hour period, and this governs our body's release of hormones, our activity, our behavior, and mood. When our circadian rhythms get out of sync, we're liable to diabetes, depression, seasonal adjustment disorder. The third principle, and because we've become so urbanized, we need to find ways of connecting ourselves back to nature. And the research demonstrates that having elements within our interior landscapes that reflect and mimic natural materials has a physical and mental benefit. And the fourth item is remembering that we're human people, we're humans, that we have emotional needs throughout the day, that we can sit and focus on tasks, but equally we need to find spaces to recuperate our mental and physical energy so that we can restore our attention, restore our activity. Now, what happens when we create spaces that have these 4 elements? Well, incredible things can happen. In schools, for instance, children can learn 20 to 25% faster in natural light. Their absenteeism can go down, test results can go up. Now, when we give children a better experience in education, they're more likely to go through the system. That's better for the student because they learn more. It's better for the education system. And then we see that knowledge filtering into the national economy. In hospitals, research demonstrates that patients get better faster with less medication and feel less pain in hospital spaces that have a connection to natural light and views of nature. Just think about the enormous financial benefits from these statistics to the NHS if we just thought about connecting hospitals with a sense of nature. Our homes can become calmer, more stress-free spaces, and incredibly, rates of crime, domestic violence can go down dramatically, and property values can go up when we place them in landscapes that are well designed with a connection to biophilic landscapes. And in offices, well, offices can be calmer, more stress-free, more resilient to the everyday pressures that we face all the time. Now, recent research by Couple Makers Interface suggests that actually, when we create offices with biophilic elements, these are the results. People report a 15% higher level of well-being. When they talk about that, they're more engaged, they're more connected. In fact, they're 6% more productive and 15% more creative when they're working in offices with natural light, with plants, with natural materials and recuperative spaces. These are kind of incredible statistics that we should be finding ways to incorporate into all the building types that we live and work in. And the people that are taking advantage of this, it's not surprisingly those at the very forefront of office and workplace design. Companies such as Apple, Google, and Amazon are spending enormous amounts of time and energy incorporating biophilic design into the workplace, not just to create productive, creative spaces, but also in the war for talent, to attract the best minds and to retain them once they're there. Because the people that work here are not going to want to go back to a windowless office underground somewhere. Biophilic design is not just about bringing the outside in, it's about creating a deeper connection to nature and natural processes. And when we do that, we can reduce blood pressure levels, heart rate levels, we can reduce stress. Now, when we create spaces with less stress, then amazing things can happen. We can be more productive, more creative, and we have a better potential for cross-fertilizing ideas with our fellow colleagues. Enormous opportunities exist to organizations that embrace these ideas in all building typologies, because the research demonstrates that this human-centered approach of biophilic design can offer tangible benefits, creating more mindful, calmful spaces. It's better for people, it's better for profit, it's better for the planet. What more could we really want? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oliver. So, Peter, it would be fantastic to hear from you, just broadly, having heard about urbanisation, the challenge particularly for those of us who live and work in Europe, which is already heavily urbanised, not just about new megacities, it's about reshaping where we live and reshaping the buildings and spaces. What are the wider economic implications, and where is the wider thought space on the economy and how it's needing to be rewired for the future?
Yeah, and I think also how to turn that into meaningful business strategies, things that actually can go to scale at speed. So I'll touch on some of that. Let me start off with a thank you, a warning, and a question. So firstly, thank you very much to Havas, thank you to Sharon, thank you to Paul and Tasha. I think this is a great idea to create something recurrent like this, but also thank you on our part on Accenture Strategy. You've been a great partner over recent years, and we really enjoy working with you guys. The warning is I'm going to do this naked, but don't get worried. I'm going to do it without PowerPoint. I'm not going to impose that on anyone on a Tuesday afternoon. And then the third thing is to pose a question, which is how many of you, raise your hands, if you think that we are on track, broadly speaking, to 2030 and then on to 2050 to create a sustainable global economy that can, to Tasha's opening point, sustain 7, 8, 9 billion people within planetary boundaries. Hands up if you think we're on track. Anyone want to venture and advance on that? Well, that seems pretty conclusive. Second question, how many of you think business is doing enough to meet its obligations and responsibility to create that sustainable economy? Okay, so we have a pretty unanimous backdrop, I think, to this conversation, which is, to the point that Paul made, we are at the foothills and there is still a very, very long way to go. And the reason I asked that question is because that is exactly the question that we asked 1,000 chief executives around the world from 27 industries, from more than 100 different countries. And this is part of a piece of work that I've been doing now for the last 10 years first for Kofi Annan, and then more recently for Ban Ki-moon, to try and help him and also the UN leadership understand how they can partner more effectively with business to work towards some of these long-term sustainable development goals. And I think what's really interesting in the latest set of findings from that research is that, broadly speaking, chief executives agree with you. So only slightly more than 30% believe that we're on track for a sustainable economy within planetary boundaries. And only 30% of them believe that business is doing enough. And for those of you like some of us here who've spent a lot of time working with chief executives, they tend to be pretty bullish about most things, and they tend to be pretty confident in their own abilities and their own view of the future. So 30% sounds a lot higher than 0% in this room, right? But actually in the bigger scheme of things, I think it means that they also recognize that there is a real challenge ahead. And I think what that means for me is that we know that we're nowhere near heading towards true north in terms of a global economy or in terms of businesses. In fact, actually, if you look at this more quantitatively, we're headed due south. If you look at almost any major metric, whether or not it's carbon emissions, whether or not it's global biodiversity, whether or not it's the challenge of inclusion and the Gini coefficients around the world, we've got a lot of global challenges to manage within our economic context. And also on the other side of that coin, I think a huge opportunity for business leaders to tap into what look like problems, but may well be new markets, new opportunities for innovation. So I would say that, for me at least, when you ask the question, what is meaningful growth, at least a very major part of that answer is the circular economy. And I think when you ask, how do you go about creating real value and impact through meaningful brands, I think a lot of that ends up being around what I call circular advantage. And circular economy, for those of you who aren't aware of the concept but perhaps have worked around similar issues, is really the idea that we can decouple our global economies from natural resource use, from waste, from environmental impact, so that we can actually produce the prosperity, the wealth, the economic development that we want, but without some of the negative consequences that we've seen of the last 200 years of the Industrial Revolution. Essentially a model that's been built on the idea of linear value chains, linear economies, take, make, waste, to a world that is about take, make, take, make, take, make, take, make, where we don't waste useful natural resources, where we think differently about providing customers and consumers and citizens with the utility and the value of products and brands, but dematerializing as much as is possible those positive impacts on our lives and consumption from the negative consequences that we often see hardwired, to use your term of rewiring, hardwired into the incentives and structures and the way that we manage our global economy. And I'll leave you with the results from the last couple of years. The last 10 years, I've been focusing personally on this journey and helping organizations to understand where their opportunities lie. But what I would say is that over the last couple of years, we've tried to put that into a much more structured, much easier to understand format for business leaders looking at where their opportunity lies. And we've talked about this as the circular advantage. And so for the last 2 years, we looked at 6,000 companies around the world, high-performing companies, companies that are genuinely by traditional metrics considered to be very successful, but are also experimenting with these circular economy models. Either small, innovative businesses that are disrupting industries and markets from the margins, or some of the bigger businesses that are looking to reorient the way they think about their growth models and their business models. And we've got it down to about 120 companies, which will form the sort of centerpiece of the book that Sharon mentioned, which will be out next month. And what we've tried to do is understand the 5 key business models that the winners seem to consistently be using, and also the technologies that they're deploying. Because very much as Simon mentioned, I think that one of the most interesting features of the research shows there is a huge opportunity at the nexus of the digital revolution taking place. Social mobility, social media, analytics, cloud computing, the industrial Internet of Things. There is a huge opportunity at the confluence of the physical and digital world emerging around circular economy. And I'll finish with those 5 business models. So the first is very much around shifting circular supplies and renewable inputs. Changing out things that are no longer necessary or no longer usable, whether it's chemicals, whether it's energy, whether or not it's materials, for renewable, biodegradable materials and sources. Secondly, it's about looking at new models for recovery and recycling, looking at ways to avoid embedded values being lost because we send them to landfill or that we burn otherwise valuable material. Thirdly, it's about what I call the product life extension model. It's about refurbishing, remarketing, reprocessing, remanufacturing existing assets, existing parts and pieces. The story I often talk about is Caterpillar. Some of you will have been aware of Caterpillar and their work manufacturing large construction equipment. This is an extraordinary innovative business unit that Caterpillar have set up now with more than 4,000 people working on remanufacturing. It's the most profitable part of Caterpillar. It hasn't cannibalized their new products and services. It's more than 90% increase in terms of the energy efficiency of those products and 80% in terms of the natural resource use. Wins on every front there. The fourth model is around the sharing economy and the way that sharing economy models like Airbnb, Uber, Lyft, Peerby are allowing us to think differently about our use of goods and services and whether we need to own them or whether or not there are different ways to think about exchanging value. How many of you have a car, a personal car? I have one, so I'll admit it too. How many? Just give me a guess, rough guess. How many of you, so what do you think the average utilization rate of a personal automobile is in an average month? How much of its time is actually being used? 20%? 10? 3? Anyone else want to advance on that? That's a pretty good spectrum.
I think it depends where you live.
That's a very good answer. It does. And so if you take the global average across settings in both urban and rural areas, it's about 6 to 8%. Right? Now, what's interesting is, and whoever said, put your hand up if you said 3. Right? So if you then look at that 6 to 8%, approximately 50% of that 6 to 8% is spent in traffic or finding parking. Right? Which, now, I don't know about you guys, but that doesn't sound like a very good use of my second most expensive asset after my home. Forget the sustainability implications of all of the embedded materials, the fossil fuels, the metals. This is about the stupidest thing we could do with our money. Right? I mean, it really is. So it's not just that Uber and Lyft and these sorts of players come up, but also we see carpooling, we see a whole spectrum of digital and physical solutions emerging that changes the way we think about personal mobility, and that's creating enormous new opportunities. And then finally, the shift from products to services. Again, very important for the concept of meaningful brands, because to shift from a product to service, you need to trust the company. Changes your relationship from a single purchase to a long relationship over potentially many life cycles of a car, of a product. So all of these 5, I think, are at the core of what it means to create meaningful growth, disruptive new opportunities, and to really take advantage of the circular economy as we look to disrupt and go back in a circle to my beginning, to create a sustainable global economy to 2030 and beyond that allows us to live meaningfully, prosperously within planetary boundaries.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to sort of skip ahead a little bit because 2 things have happened. Firstly, we've just had the 3 most articulate people on the planet speak in a row, and so there's very little that perhaps hasn't been unearthed or at least suggested. That's not to say this isn't a much deeper and much tougher conversation. It certainly is, and we hope that in the coffee break you will grab Simon and Oliver and Peter. But just to sort of sum up, I think what we heard collectively is that the way that we operate has to be of a collaborative nature. We can't see business as separate from local government, as separate from national government, as separate from international fora. We can't see the simplicity of building design and what we put on our floors as separate from human well-being. So we need to really think in a much different way than we do today. And if we can achieve that aim, if just a small proportion of us can, wow, can't we really show the way for a much more positive and prosperous future? So please feel free, I'm offering on behalf of others here, but please feel free to grab any of these three fantastic speakers during the coffee break. So what I'd like to do now is hand back to Natasha, who will introduce Paul and some fantastic speakers in the next session.